Thank you. I was looking earlier and worked out that it's something like 19 years since I've had to address a LINX meeting. So I think that was a reasonably good time off. So I'm back in bat now. Some of you may have already seen this presentation, so apologies for that. I've been sort of doing some looking into how we did things in days of yore. That being the mid to late 1990s. It feels like days of yore. A year ago, spoke about what service providers were offering, how we did it. And then last month at UK North, I was talking about pretty much my time working at the LINX. Lots of infrastructure scaling challenges, what the data centers were doing, the important places, the headaches we had. But first, digital archaeology is quite hard work. I don't know if you can all see up there. There's a couple of DDS2 backup tapes and a jazz disc. Now, Keith loved jazz discs. All of the LINX stuff was backed up on these. I forced us to buy a media changer that took DAT drives because they seemed a little bit more common. But sadly, despite me having these, trying to actually get data off them was a different thing altogether. And this actually sparked a lightning talk that I gave last week at the Right meeting about how hard it is to reliably keep data. The old machines die, old media dies, it doesn't really play very well. So if you are doing something interesting and you want to store it, keep it on spinning disks or keep it on SSDs or keep it on your NAS or something and keep copying it forwards because that tends to work. However, the LINX. So some chap in the LINX office made this stupid pronouncement in the late 1990s. We're only about, 7.5 times that? But to be fair, at the time, Thomas Watson from IBM, he'd said there was a market for 5 computers, and the 5 computers he was talking about were very different from what we consider computers now, in the same way as the 100 members that I was talking about back then weren't content providers, they weren't the smaller ISPs, they were very much the really big providers around the world. Interconnection back then, well, yeah, there was May East, there was May West in the US, the big ones in Europe were there, NetNode, LINX, AMSIX, but the exchanges were few and far between. It wasn't like it is now where pretty much every major city has managed to get a switch together and is doing some form of peering. And everything was expensive. Bandwidth was expensive, colo was expensive, heck, even a 64K ISDN line was expensive. Well, they still are expensive. And the LINX itself, well, having just sat through the updated LON 2 presentation, this looks a little bit laughable, doesn't it? There was one LAN, present in Telehouse North only, which consisted of 7 switches. I mean, we're really pushing the boat out here. So there were some 2 Catalyst 5000s, and that is a picture of switch 0, I believe, .links.net from back then. And look at that astounding port density. That's got a whole 1,200 meg Ethernet ports, and a whole 24 10 meg Ethernet ports, and 2 FIDI cards. FIDI was an interesting obsession of certain LINX board members of the day. It was used as the backbone, but was also sold as a connection technology for some members, who shall remain nameless, Alex. This was a Cisco Catalyst 1200. This one is actually in the Science Museum. This is the original switch1.links.net. Cisco was so enraged that one of their switches was being put in a museum, they refused to turn up when we did the unveiling of this, whenever it was. Can't remember, probably about 10 years ago or something. And this is a plain tree FIDI switch. That's actually the bigger version. Now, some of you will know of my love of plain tree FIDI switches in that, let's just say in the testing and the product evaluation, they performed very well, but in production, not so. And the only way I eventually got their support department to pay attention to my complaints was to threaten to invite the computing press and throw them off the roof of Telehouse into the moat below. For those of you who aren't as old as me, where the car park is in between Telehouse North and the admin building in East and West used to be a nice little moat, remnants of the dock. So how did all this fit together? Well, thankfully, Keith produced a nice slide for Nanog 15. That was in January 1999. And it shows really what is quite simply 3 rings with the 2 wave switches in the middle. And it essentially 100 meg connections to members. This was high speed, guys. 100 meg connections to members came off those 2 wave switches and came off the Catalyst 5000, and their backup connections at a whopping 10 meg, you get more than that with your DSL line, came off the Cat 1200s, and assorted other connections like the collector LAN and things like that were just hanging off one of the member switches. Well, obviously we have to have a stats graph. Now, these were in the days that MRTG went up and to the left, so it's not actually a dismal performance. Obviously, the stats system was thoroughly broken between April and June. That was a bit of a recurring theme. And as you can see, it was just about managing 300 megasecond average traffic, peaking at about 400. The peak graph's not there. And we had a whole 53 members in October 1998. 9,000 routes out of a global table of 55,000, so that percentage has grown a lot better as the LINX has grown. And an interesting blip at the beginning of November, which we shall come back to later. So, as Patrick alluded to, the LINX joining process was slightly convoluted. There were the mythical 3 trace routes, so you had to, as a joining member, have to provide 3 trace routes from your network to root servers other than K, that didn't go through another member's connectivity. This kind of excluded content providers, smaller ISPs, and pretty much led to the direct formation of LONAP for those traditional tier 2s. What was laughable was that a couple of LINX members, who again shall remain nameless, were happily selling 64K layer 2 services to New York just to get around this so that other people could join. So we did an upgrade. 100 meg FIDI was a little slow. The interswitch links were running at about 99.8 megabits a second, and members, troublesome things members, were asking for 1 gig connections. So Nick Lewis and I went off to the States and looked at Extreme and looked at packet engines. Packet engines were great because they had a marketing department that made wooden whistles that sounded like those wonderful American trains. Yeah, I have one somewhere. And so we selected the Power Rail and the Summit, and these were actually these were quite good devices. That was the first Power Rail that went in. You can tell that I didn't put it in because it looks neat and tidy. That's a mixture of 10, 100, and 1 gig, and we still had FIDI ports because there were customers who still wanted them. Packet Engines was acquired shortly afterwards by Alcatel, which was a bit of a shame because the Packet Engines guys were really, really good, and it was never quite the same after Alcatel bought them out. That was the first Extreme switch that went in. These were all on the same LAN, so when these went in, it was very much an extension of the original design. So this still was one LAN, despite the fact there were 2 vendors. I think the seeds had been sown to go to dual LAN, but it certainly didn't happen in my time. That was a few years later. That was the first Extreme Summit 48 that ever went into the LINX, and I still have that switch, and it still works. Not that we use it. So this led to a bit of a problem, this upgrade to a gig. So FIDI had some inherent protection. It was useful. It had auto failover and all these other good things. GigE didn't. And there was a full and frank exchange of views between Keith and I over merits of spanning tree. There were numerous exchanges of views like this where the rest of the LINX office hid. But it did lead to good technical outcomes and a sort of begrudging agree to disagree or compromise. Yeah, the initial migration, first weekend of November, didn't go too well. These were the days when Ethernet cards were a little bit non-standard, people were pushing the boundaries, we had negotiation problems. The maintenance work and downtime made the national press, but didn't make the tech newsletter of the day. So that was the 6th of November, and I'm not sure how upset I was that I'd made the Telegraph, but not the need to know. Underlined a recurring theme, though, and I know that LINX techies who've followed me and other technical people at IXPs know the load that an IXP places on a layer 2 switch is seemingly very different from everything that the switch vendors expect. They expect a very LAN-centric flow. meshiness of IXPs really causes them to struggle, and the CAP 5000 was particularly bad at this. And we had some addressing challenges as well. We had a /23 of PI space, and that was way too small, so we did what everybody did back then, became an LIR, acquired a /19. Remember those heady days of /19s being given out. Duly carved up, renumbered the peering LAN. And I've been apologising to everybody for about 10 years that you all had to do a secondary numbering, but I found a file where each peering LAN had a /22 from the word go, so it wasn't my fault you had to renumber again after all. What else did we have at the LINX? Well, we hosted the original k.rootservers.net, and the jar of Marmite is there for reasons that I can't even begin to go into. And we hosted the .uk primary name server, and that clearly came from PSINet because it's a cheap Sun clone. Key infrastructure, DNS was interesting. Traffic levels were low, as you can see. Queries and responses were, well, enlightening. So I did a snapshot to present, I think it was to an IETF. 19% of requests led to an NX domain on k.root, and 6% of queries came from 1918 space. And I can't begin to think that that's got any better since. The other thing we did is we went to a second building. Now, this was actually quite contentious at the time because it was are we competing with our members? Built a pop in the new, it was Equant ITS started it, proved to be not very competent at doing it, so TeleCity bought them out, and then Equinix bought them out, then Digital Realty bought them out, but it's the good old Bonington on Mill Harbour. Dark fibre between there and Telehouse, and pretty much, depending on whose marketing department you ask, LINX or AMSIX went into two buildings at the same time, or first. Talking of data centres, London was pretty thin, Telehouse North, yeah, but mostly dealing room disaster recovery. Telehouse Metro had recently opened, TeleCity in Mill Harbour, nothing like there is today. Wasn't much elsewhere. There was the original TeleCity in Manchester, some sort of provider-specific facilities, but they were more computer centres than data centres that we'd know of now. Connectivity itself was a challenge. Ethernet wasn't the go-to protocol. There was still ATM, frame relay, POS, you name it. Typical speeds pretty slow, 155 meg, 622 meg for backbones, 2 meg customers. The other thing was on the LAN, Ethernet over IP wasn't necessarily the default. Fidian token ring was still there, and IPX and AppleTalk were still protocols of choice. Those protocols so loved by CCIE question setters of the past. There were some light-hearted moments. At a meeting like this, a surefire way to get all of the mess cleared on the peering LAN was to TCP dump the non-IP traffic. Had to make sure the MAC addresses were big enough for the members to see, but by the end of the presentation session, some of the cruft had generally gone away. There was one member who shall absolutely remain nameless, who was caught with a GRE tunnel over existing members for all of their international transit. When this was shut down, they didn't really last for much longer, as you can imagine. Their defense of this was that I'd plugged a Cat5 cable into the wrong port, so that had caused all of this traffic to go the wrong way. And we hosted Right 31 in Edinburgh. That was a good laugh. Connectivity was provided by LINX. There was another GRE tunnel over Janet. Unfortunately, the next hop neighbour in London was learnt via the BGP peering session to it. This router had a bit of an existential crisis, and we didn't dare reboot it. I can't find the config, sadly. And there was an enterprising startup that tried to capitalise on both the Telehouse and the LINX name. This led to a lot of engagement of lawyers. Thankfully, and it's not often you'll hear me say this, PSINet came along to the rescue and bought them out, and that problem went away. And that would be another talk for another time. That's the lovely logo from the late 90s, and the marketing department love it so much that I felt that I had to put it here. Any questions, anyone? Or do we all want tea and coffee? Arsenic? Oh, reverse. I can't remember what's there. He's going to heckle me about what's there. I'm not sure whether this version of this talk's on there, actually.
Hello. Hi, Paul.
No, don't heckle.
Yeah, you left me with a wave switch to still eliminate from the network, didn't you?
I wasn't allowed to throw it off the roof. I really wanted to.
I think we did that for you in the end. AMS-IX LINX dual site thing, it really depends on how you count it.
That's what I concluded.
The AMS-IX was always present in 2 buildings on the science park. It was always present in the NICF and in SARA, which is now Vansys Interaction, for people who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about. And also it depends on whether you count IBR LAN, which was this yellow thick net installation that went around these 2 buildings and around the science park building generally, and it was a yellow hose pipe, and you just came along with your AUI adapter and your VAMPAT app and plugged into it. So yeah, you could count AMS-IX as actually being the first multi-site in the sense that, more multi-building in the sense that it went into multi-buildings, but LINX was first in running crosstown fiber. AMS-IX had not done crosstown fiber because I was in the employ of LINX when that happened.
Right. So I think that settles that. We had the fiber first. I've got off lightly.
Excellent. Okay, thanks.